The most expensive mistake you can make is assuming silence means permission. That was the sentence running through my mind as the auctioneer's wooden gavel echoed across my steel yard on a cool Friday morning. The sharp crack bounced off stacks of rust-colored I-beams and galvanized pipe until it faded into the steady hum of diesel generators somewhere beyond the warehouse. Buyers in reflective safety vests quietly raised numbered paddles while forklifts waited nearby with engines idling, ready to move thousands of pounds of structural steel to their new owners. The smell of machine oil, warm metal, and fresh-cut lumber drifted through the crisp air, mixing with the familiar scent I had grown up breathing since I was old enough to hold a tape measure. Then the front gate slammed open. Every conversation stopped at once. Melissa Grant marched across the gravel lot wearing an immaculate white blazer that looked wildly out of place among steel racks, loading cranes, and heavy equipment. Her polished heels clicked against the concrete loading pad as though she still believed she controlled everything she walked into. Behind her came two members of the Homeowners Association board, both carrying thick folders and wearing expressions that suggested they expected this entire event to stop the moment they arrived. Melissa pointed directly at the massive stack of steel beams sitting beside the auction platform. "That belongs to our contractors," she announced loudly enough for everyone in the yard to hear. "This auction is over." The auctioneer looked toward me without saying a word. I simply checked the calendar hanging inside the office window before looking back at Melissa. 30 days ago, I said calmly. "You might have been right." Her confident smile disappeared just enough for me to notice. The buyers remained silent. Nobody lowered a paddle. Nobody left. They were all waiting to see who actually understood the law better. "My name is Ethan Walker. I am 39 years old, and my family has worked with steel for 3 generations. My grandfather built this yard with one welding truck and more determination than money. My father expanded it into one of the largest metal recycling and structural steel recovery businesses in Central Texas. By the time I inherited the operation, we handled everything from industrial salvage and commercial demolition to certified storage for oversized construction materials. Around here, every beam has a serial number, every trailer has paperwork, and every piece of equipment sitting on this property has a legal status. Nothing simply appears, and nothing simply disappears. People think a steel yard is just piles of rusty metal. They are wrong. It is a business built on records, chain of custody, storage agreements, and deadlines that most people never bother reading until they are already too late. Melissa had never understood that. She thought seeing an open parking area near my entrance meant she had discovered free storage for her neighborhood's construction project. She saw empty pavement. I saw designated parking spaces protected by signs, cameras, inventory logs, and state regulations that had been hanging in plain sight for years. As the morning breeze rattled loose chains hanging from a nearby crane, I glanced once more at the stack of steel now attracting bids that climbed higher every few seconds. Melissa still believed she had walked in just in time to stop me. What she did not realize was that every hour of the past 30 days had been quietly leading to this exact moment. I rewound that morning in my mind so many times that I could still hear the sound of the first pickup truck pulling into my parking lot exactly 30 days earlier. It was just after 7 on a Monday. The Texas sun had barely climbed over the warehouse roof, casting long shadows across rows of stacked steel plate and freshly painted storage containers. The smell of hot coffee mixed with cutting oil drifted through the open fabrication shop while welders prepared equipment for another ordinary workday. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become the beginning of the strangest legal lesson my business had ever witnessed. My family had operated Walker Steel Recovery for almost 70 years. My grandfather started by collecting scrap from abandoned oil fields after the Korean War. My father expanded the company into structural steel storage, commercial recycling, and industrial salvage. By the time I took over, we had become one of the few licensed facilities in the region capable of storing oversized commercial construction materials under documented chain of custody. Every trailer entering our yard was photographed. Every shipment received a storage record. Every customer signed paperwork before unloading a single pound of steel. People often assumed we simply stacked metal wherever there was empty space. The reality was exactly the opposite. Every square foot inside our property had a purpose. Near the front entrance sat a paved lot with a large blue sign reading, "Free Customer Parking." Directly beneath those words, in slightly smaller letters, another sign read, "Passenger Vehicles Only. No equipment. No commercial storage. Violators subject to state storage regulations." The signs had been there for years. Most people noticed all of them. Apparently, Melissa Grant only noticed the first two words. Around mid-morning, I heard the deep rumble of a lowboy trailer approaching the entrance. Instead of stopping at the office like every commercial driver normally did, the truck rolled straight into the customer parking area and slowly lowered several massive structural steel beams onto the pavement. Bright orange lifting straps slapped against the trailer deck as the crane operator finished unloading. I walked outside expecting someone to ask where the delivery belonged. Instead, the driver climbed back into his cab, nodded politely, and drove away. Less than 10 minutes later, another trailer arrived carrying galvanized pipe. Then another loaded with heavy steel columns. By lunchtime, nearly half the parking lot had disappeared beneath construction materials. I called the number printed on one of the contractor trucks. The project manager sounded genuinely confused. "The Homeowners Association president told us this was approved overflow storage," he explained. "She said parking was free and the owner did not mind." I thanked him for the information without raising my voice. Getting angry at contractors following instructions would solve nothing. I simply walked back into my office, opened the security camera archive, and watched every truck arrive from 3 different angles. The timestamps were clear. The warning signs were visible. Every license plate could be read without zooming in. Outside my office window, forklifts continued moving inventory, while the unexpected steel remained exactly where it had been unloaded. Most people would have driven straight to the neighborhood demanding answers. I did something much quieter. I opened the storage compliance manual that had been sitting on my bookshelf for years, turned to the section covering abandoned commercial property, and began reading with a fresh cup of coffee while the calendar on my desk quietly marked the first day. By the second day, the parking lot looked less like customer parking and more like the loading yard of a commercial construction company. Fresh steel beams stretched across painted parking lines, galvanized pipe rested on wooden blocks, and bundles of metal decking reflected the afternoon sunlight like giant mirrors. Every time a trailer rolled through my front gate, the familiar hiss of air brakes echoed across the yard before another load settled onto pavement that had never been intended for storage. My employees kept glancing toward my office, waiting for me to walk outside and put an end to it. Instead, I kept working. Around noon, my operations manager, Mike Dawson, stepped into my office carrying a clipboard. "Are we really going to let them keep unloading out there?" he asked while looking through the front window. I took another sip of coffee before answering. "Not forever." He looked confused. "Then why are we waiting?" I pointed toward the security monitor showing 4 camera angles of the parking lot. Every truck entering the property passed directly beneath clearly visible signs. Every driver slowed long enough for the cameras to capture license plates, company logos, and the warning posted beneath the large blue customer parking sign. "Because every minute they stay there," I said quietly, "the paperwork becomes stronger than any argument." Mike had worked beside my father for nearly 20 years. He knew that whenever I became unusually calm, I had already started planning several steps ahead. He nodded once and walked back outside without asking another question. That afternoon, Melissa Grant finally appeared. She arrived in a spotless white sport utility vehicle that contrasted sharply against the dust and gravel covering the steel yard. Wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a leather folder under one arm, she stepped confidently onto the sidewalk as though she were inspecting one of her own neighborhood projects. "I wanted to thank you for being so cooperative," she said with a bright smile. "Our contractors were spending a fortune on temporary storage." I looked toward the growing stacks of steel before turning back to her. "Did someone from my office sign a storage agreement?" I asked. She laughed softly as if I had made a harmless joke. "Your sign says free parking. Empty pavement is empty pavement." I slowly pointed toward the smaller sign directly underneath the larger one. She barely glanced at it before shrugging. "Nobody reads the fine print." That sentence stayed with me long after she drove away. Nobody reads the fine print. Back inside my office, I opened a new digital file labeled Willow Creek Materials. Every photograph from every security camera was copied into the folder. I recorded arrival times, estimated weights, contractor names, trailer numbers, and exact storage locations inside the parking lot. Then I walked outside with a small yellow inventory tag and attached a numbered identification marker to each separate stack of steel. Every tag was photographed before and after placement. Every image carried the correct date and time. The sound of forklifts moving legitimate customer shipments continued around me while the unauthorized materials remained untouched. Nothing was moved. Nothing was damaged. Everything stayed exactly where Melissa believed she had cleverly saved money. As the sun dropped lower behind the warehouse, warm orange light reflected across hundreds of feet of structural steel. Standing there, I realized she had made one critical mistake. She thought she had found free space. She never stopped to ask what the law called property that someone intentionally leaves behind on another person's commercial lot without permission. I never touched a single piece of their steel. That was the part people found hardest to believe later. Every beam, every pipe, every pallet stayed exactly where the contractors had unloaded it. My crew worked around the growing stacks as though they had become permanent fixtures. Forklifts carried customer orders through carefully marked lanes while yellow safety cones protected the unauthorized materials from accidental damage. The steady rhythm of welding torches, reversing loaders, and cutting saws filled the yard from sunrise until evening. But the steel belonging to the neighborhood project remained completely untouched. That was important because the law rewards careful documentation, not impatience. On the morning of the fourth day, I prepared the first certified notice. Every word came directly from the applicable commercial storage regulations. The letter identified the property, listed the inventory tags attached to every load, included photographs, documented the exact location of the materials, and explained that unauthorized commercial property had been left on privately owned business premises. It also outlined the procedures required to recover the materials before additional legal remedies became available. Susan Keller, the attorney who handled regulatory matters for my company, reviewed every sentence before the envelopes left my office. "Keep everything professional," she reminded me. "Facts win these cases, not frustration." By lunchtime, the certified letters were on their way to the construction company, the general contractor, and the Homeowners Association office addressed to Melissa Grant. Then we waited. 2 days later, the postal receipts began returning one by one, each carrying signatures confirming delivery. I placed every green receipt into a binder labeled Willow Creek Materials. Mike joked that I treated paperwork better than some people treated family photographs. He was probably right. Paperwork has a remarkable habit of remembering details long after conversations become arguments. Melissa finally called late that Friday afternoon. Her voice sounded cheerful enough that I wondered whether she had actually read the letter. "I think your attorney made this sound much more serious than it really is," she said. "The contractors will move everything when they finish the next phase." I looked through my office window toward the parking lot where sunlight reflected brightly across hundreds of feet of structural steel. "The notice explains the timeline," I answered calmly. "You should read every page." She laughed again, exactly the same way she had laughed beside the parking sign. "You business owners always try to scare people with legal language." Before hanging up, she added one sentence that quietly settled every doubt I still had. "Besides, nobody is going to claim abandoned steel after only a few weeks." I thanked her for calling and immediately wrote a summary of the conversation including the exact time, date, and everything both of us had said. Susan later added the call log to our growing evidence binder. Over the next 3 weeks, more notices went out according to the required schedule. Every mailing contained updated photographs, revised inventories, storage calculations, and clear instructions explaining how the materials could be recovered through the proper process. Every deadline passed without payment, without pickup, and without a signed storage agreement. Meanwhile, the steel remained exactly where it had always been. Rain washed dust from the beams. Morning dew collected on galvanized pipe before drying beneath the Texas sun. Birds occasionally landed on the highest stacks as though they had become part of the landscape. Melissa believed nothing was happening because nothing appeared to be changing. She never realized the most important changes were taking place inside filing cabinets, certified mail records, and calendars where every passing day quietly moved the case one step closer to a completely different legal outcome. I never counted the 30 days as a waiting period. I counted them as evidence accumulating one page at a time. Every morning before the fabrication shop opened, I walked through the parking lot with a digital camera, photographing every tagged bundle from the same angle as the day before. The steel never moved. The inventory numbers remained exactly where I had attached them. Overnight rain left dark streaks across the beams before the Texas sun dried them by mid-morning. Wind occasionally carried dust across the galvanized pipe, but nothing suggested anyone had returned to inspect or recover the materials. The consistency mattered. A documented pattern always carries more weight than a single photograph. Inside my office, the binder labeled Willow Creek materials had grown thick enough that the metal rings barely closed. Certified mail receipts, delivery confirmations, dated photographs, inventory sheets, storage calculations, phone logs, security camera stills, and attorney correspondence filled nearly every section. Susan Keller reviewed the file one afternoon while the sound of forklifts echoed through the warehouse behind us. She slowly turned each page before looking up with the same calm expression she always wore when everything had been done correctly. "If this reaches court," she said, "the facts will tell the story without either of us saying very much." That was exactly what I wanted. The law works best when it speaks through documents instead of emotions. On the 25th day, another certified notice was delivered. This time marked final opportunity to recover stored property. It outlined every previous communication, listed every unanswered deadline, and explained the remaining legal process in clear language. There were no threats, no dramatic wording, only dates, regulations, inventory lists, and the final deadline. The signed delivery receipt came back 3 days later. Melissa had personally accepted the envelope. I knew that because her signature appeared clearly beside the delivery time. Yet nothing changed. No payment arrived. No trucks entered the yard. No contractor contacted my office requesting access. The parking lot remained quiet except for my regular customers using the few remaining parking spaces that had not been covered by steel. Mike eventually walked into my office carrying another stack of work orders and shook his head toward the window. "Do you think they finally figured it out?" he asked. I glanced at the calendar hanging above my desk. 5 days remained. "If they had," I replied, "someone would already be standing at our front counter." Instead, Melissa chose confidence over curiosity. She apparently believed ignoring official notices somehow prevented the legal timeline from continuing. Businesses do not work that way. Neither do state regulations. On the evening before the 30th day, I stayed later than usual after every employee had gone home. The yard became almost perfectly silent except for distant highway traffic and the occasional metallic click of cooling steel. I walked slowly between the neatly tagged bundles one last time. My flashlight reflected softly across smooth galvanized surfaces while cool night air carried the faint smell of machine oil and fresh rain. Every inventory tag remained exactly where I had attached it nearly a month earlier. Every photograph matched the original records. Every notice had been delivered. Every deadline had passed. I returned to my office, closed the evidence binder, and placed it beside a completed legal packet Susan had prepared earlier that afternoon. I looked once more at the calendar before switching off the lights. When the sun came up the following morning, the steel itself would not look any different. Legally, however, everything was about to change. I arrived before sunrise on the 30th morning, unlocking the front gate while the sky was still painted in deep shades of blue and gray. The steel yard felt unusually quiet. Even the familiar sounds of diesel engines and hydraulic lifts had not yet begun. Cool morning air carried the scent of damp concrete, machine oil, and freshly brewed coffee drifting from the break room. I stood for a moment beside the customer parking lot, looking across the neatly tagged stacks of structural steel that had not moved an inch since the first trailer unloaded them exactly 1 month earlier. Thin beads of dew rested along the edges of galvanized pipe, sparkling beneath the first hints of daylight. Nothing looked different. That was the remarkable part. The steel appeared exactly the same as it had on day one. Only its legal status had changed. At 8 o'clock sharp, Susan Keller arrived carrying 2 leather binders and a sealed envelope prepared the previous afternoon. We sat together inside the conference room overlooking the yard while she carefully reviewed every final document one last time. Inventory records matched the photographs. Certified mail receipts matched the delivery confirmations. Storage calculations matched the calendar. Security camera images documented every arrival and every day that followed. There were no missing pages and no unanswered questions. When Susan finally closed the binder, she smiled quietly. "Everything required by law has been completed," she said. "From this point forward, you simply follow the process." That was all I had wanted from the beginning. Process, not an argument. Around 9:30, the county deputy assigned to commercial property matters arrived to review the completed file. He spent nearly half an hour examining photographs, notices, inventory logs, and delivery receipts before walking outside to compare the documentation with the tag materials themselves. He checked identification numbers attached to several bundles, verified the locations shown in the photographs, and returned to the office with a single nod. "Everything appears consistent," he said before signing the verification report. Watching that signature appear on the final page felt strangely quiet compared to the dramatic confrontations people usually imagine. Justice rarely announces itself. Most of the time it arrives with organized paperwork and careful patience. Shortly after 10 o'clock, my receptionist transferred an incoming call from Melissa Grant. Her voice sounded hurried for the first time since this situation began. "Our contractor is sending trucks this afternoon," she explained. "We are finally ready to collect our steel." I looked through the office window toward the parking lot where morning sunlight now reflected brightly across every tagged beam. "The recovery period ended this morning," I answered calmly. Silence filled the line for several seconds. "That cannot be right," she finally replied. I reached for the binder resting beside my desk and opened it to the final certified notice bearing her signature. Every deadline, every notice, and every required procedure was delivered exactly as outlined. I said, "You received them all." She insisted there had to be some misunderstanding, but there was nothing left to misunderstand. Dates do not negotiate. Regulations do not become optional because someone ignored them. After the call ended, I quietly signed the last authorization allowing the materials to enter the next legal phase. Outside, the first auction company trucks rolled slowly through the front gate while workers began arranging temporary barriers and numbered bidding stations. The metallic sound of forklifts positioning the first bundles echoed across the yard exactly as the sun climbed above the warehouse roof. 30 days earlier, Melissa believed she had discovered free storage. Standing there that morning, I knew she had actually created the most thoroughly documented inventory my business had ever prepared. I watched the auction yard slowly come alive as buyers arrived from fabrication companies, bridge contractors, agricultural suppliers, and regional steel distributors across central Texas. Pickup trucks and flatbed trailers lined up outside the front gate, while the unmistakable smell of diesel exhaust mixed with fresh coffee and cool morning air. Forklift operators checked lifting chains one final time before positioning the first bundles inside the marked auction lanes. Every inventory tag I had attached 30 days earlier remained clearly visible beneath bright orange identification cards prepared by the auction company. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been rushed. Every step followed exactly the process outlined in the regulations. Around 10:45, the familiar white sport utility vehicle pulled sharply into the parking lot. Melissa Grant stepped out before the engine had even stopped. Her expression was completely different from the confident smile I remembered seeing beneath the customer parking sign a month earlier. She walked quickly toward the nearest stack of steel with 2 construction supervisors following close behind. One of them carried a clipboard while the other repeatedly checked his phone as though hoping a missing document might suddenly appear. "Stop moving those beams," Melissa called toward the forklift operator. The operator immediately lowered the load back onto its wooden supports and looked at me for instructions. I calmly raised one hand, signaling him to pause until the situation was clarified. Melissa stopped only a few feet away from my office entrance. "Our contractor is here," she said. "We are loading everything today." I invited her inside the conference room instead of continuing the conversation in the middle of the yard. Susan Keller was already seated at the table beside the completed evidence binders. The county deputy remained nearby reviewing inventory sheets, while the auction manager quietly waited outside for instructions. Susan opened the binder to the final section and gently slid several documents across the table. Melissa barely glanced at the pages before pushing them back. "This is just paperwork," she insisted. Susan answered in the same calm tone she had used throughout the entire process. "Commercial property law is paperwork." She then walked Melissa through every certified notice, every delivery receipt, every signed acknowledgement, every inventory photograph, every storage calculation, and every deadline that had passed without response. The room remained remarkably quiet except for the soft turning of paper pages and the distant sound of forklifts idling outside. Melissa's construction supervisor finally spoke. "We thought those letters were only billing notices." Susan nodded politely. Each notice clearly explained the legal consequences of failing to recover the stored property within the required period. The supervisor lowered his eyes toward the table without saying another word. The county deputy then confirmed that he had independently verified the inventory, reviewed the documentation, and completed the required inspection that morning. There was no argument left to resolve because the facts had already been established weeks earlier. Melissa looked through the conference room window toward the steel stacked neatly outside. Buyers were quietly inspecting bundles while auction staff prepared registration paperwork. She whispered almost to herself, "I really thought free parking meant nobody cared." I shook my head gently. Parking and storage have never been the same thing. Outside, the auctioneer tested the public address system, his voice echoing softly across the steel yard as bidders gathered near the first marked lot. The entire process had unfolded exactly as the calendar predicted. No confrontation had changed the outcome. No raised voices had decided ownership. Only 30 carefully documented days, a complete paper trail, and the simple decision to let the law move at its own steady pace had brought everyone to that conference room overlooking the same parking lot where this story quietly began. The auction officially began at 11 o'clock with the sharp crack of the auctioneer's wooden gavel echoing across the steel yard. Buyers gathered around the first marked lot, while forklifts carefully lifted bundles of structural beams onto display blocks where every identification tag remained attached exactly as they had been documented throughout the previous month. Warm sunlight reflected from clean galvanized surfaces, forcing several bidders to shade their eyes as they inspected each load. The rhythmic hum of diesel engines blended with the soft voices of contractors comparing measurements, estimating fabrication costs, and calculating transportation logistics. Everything unfolded with quiet professionalism. Melissa remained standing near the edge of the bidding area, watching each moment with an expression that shifted from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. She made one final request to Susan before the first bid was accepted. "There has to be something we can still do." Susan answered gently without raising her voice. The opportunity existed throughout the entire notice period. The legal process reached its conclusion this morning. There was no satisfaction in her tone, only clarity. The auctioneer called the opening price for the first lot, and within seconds multiple paddles rose into the air. Numbers climbed steadily as experienced buyers recognized the quality of the steel. One contractor whispered to another while studying mill stamps on the beams. A bridge fabrication company representative examined the inventory sheet before immediately joining the bidding. Every increase echoed across the yard with surprising calm. There was no chaos, only organized commerce following a lawful process. Mike stood beside me with his hands resting comfortably in his pockets as another bundle sold above the estimated reserve value. He smiled quietly. "Your grandfather always said organized records become valuable when everyone else starts guessing." I nodded without taking my eyes off the auction. I had heard those words many times growing up, but I never imagined I would watch them become so literal. As the morning continued, one stack after another found new owners. Forklift operators loaded purchased materials onto waiting trailers with practiced precision, while clerks updated invoices and inventory logs inside the office. Every completed sale removed another tagged bundle from the parking lot that had been mistakenly treated as free storage only a month earlier. Melissa slowly walked toward the large blue parking sign near the entrance. For the first time, I watched her read every line from top to bottom. Her eyes paused on the smaller lettering beneath the larger words exactly where they should have paused 30 days earlier. She remained there for several seconds before quietly lowering her head. She never argued about the sign again. Before leaving, she approached me once more. "I should have read the entire notice," she admitted softly. "You should have read the entire sign first," I replied. Not with anger, but with the same calm honesty that had guided every step of this process. She gave a small nod, climbed back into her vehicle, and drove away without another word. By late afternoon, nearly the entire parking area had returned to its original purpose. Customer vehicles once again occupied freshly painted spaces where towering stacks of steel had stood for an entire month. The last forklift backed away from the final trailer as sunlight stretched long shadows across clean pavement. Looking at the now empty parking lot, it was almost difficult to believe how much had happened without a single raised voice, damaged beam, or unnecessary confrontation. The greatest change had never taken place in the steel itself. It had happened quietly inside calendars, certified mail receipts, and the simple decision to respect a process that never needed anyone's permission to keep moving forward. The following Monday morning felt remarkably ordinary, and somehow that made everything even more satisfying. The first customers pulled into the front parking lot just after sunrise, this time filling every marked space exactly as it had always been intended. Pickup trucks carrying welders, contractors, and longtime clients lined up neatly beneath the large blue parking sign, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the office and the familiar sound of forklifts moving legitimate customer orders echoed across the yard. Looking across the clean pavement, it was hard to imagine that only a few days earlier the same area had been covered by towering stacks of structural steel. My employees settled back into their normal routines without needing to maneuver around unauthorized materials. The parking lot had quietly become just a parking lot again. A week later, I ordered a brand new aluminum sign to replace the weathered one that had stood near the entrance for years. The large blue lettering still read free customer parking because that had never been the problem. Directly underneath, however, I installed a larger secondary panel than before. It simply read, "Passenger vehicles only. Commercial materials will be processed according to state storage law." The wording was not meant to embarrass anyone. It was meant to remove every possible misunderstanding before it ever had the opportunity to begin again. Mike laughed when he saw the new sign being installed. "Nobody will miss that one," he said. I smiled and handed him a wrench while the morning sun reflected brightly from the polished aluminum surface. "That is exactly the point," I answered. A few weeks after the auction, one of the contractors who had originally delivered the steel stopped by my office unexpectedly. He removed his cap before stepping inside and apologized for following instructions without verifying where he had been unloading. I shook his hand and thanked him for coming. None of the contractors had acted with bad intentions. They simply trusted information that should have been questioned before several truckloads of commercial materials ever crossed my gate. We spent nearly an hour discussing storage procedures, documentation, and the importance of reading every posted instruction before unloading expensive equipment. He left with a better understanding of the process, and I gained another long-term customer for the business. Sometimes the best business relationships begin after an honest mistake handled the right way. Every now and then I still think about the sentence Melissa spoke while standing beneath that parking sign. Nobody reads the fine print. She was right about one thing. Many people do not. But over the years I have learned that the details people ignore are often the ones protecting everyone involved. A single line on a sign. One paragraph inside a certified notice. One calendar deadline. One inventory tag attached to a steel beam. Individually they seem ordinary. Together they become the difference between assumptions and ownership. My grandfather never attended law school, but he understood that principle better than most attorneys. He used to tell me that businesses are not built by winning arguments. They are built by creating systems that continue working even when people disagree. Standing outside the office as another ordinary workday unfolded around me, I realized this entire experience had never really been about steel, parking spaces, or homeowners associations. It had always been about patience. The law rarely rewards the loudest person standing in the yard. More often, it quietly rewards the person who keeps accurate records, follows every required step, and allows time to do what emotion never can. As the afternoon breeze gently rattled the new parking sign above freshly painted lines, I locked the office door behind me with complete peace of mind. Some people believe justice arrives with dramatic speeches. Around my steel yard, it usually arrives one document, one deadline, and one carefully kept record at a time.